Kinnock, you have favoured a national ballot by the Mine Workers' Union. Mr. Scargill and his supporters don't seem to see it your way. Are you right, or are they right?
It's very difficult to make it on the basis of right and wrong. I've advocated a national ballot on the grounds that it would give cohesion to the strategy of the National Union of Mine Workers amongst the miners, and secondly, that it would evoke greater understanding and support for the case that the miners put outside the immediate ranks of the National Union of Mine Workers in the wider labour movement, amongst the rest of organised labour, and indeed in the general public too. And consequently, my opinion was last week that had I been a member of the National Union of Mine Workers National Executive, which clearly I'm not, and therefore had I been at today's conference, I would have been on those grounds and for those purposes in favour of a national ballot.
You have put it another way. You said that you want the miners to have a legitimate national voice that is not split asunder by differences of opinion. Now, do you think Mr. Scargill's is a legitimate national voice?
I think that, of course, he's the elected president of the National Union of Mine Workers. He has strong support from the executive and from regional executives and from the rank and file. And on that ground, of course, Arthur Scargill's legitimacy is not in any sense in doubt. The purpose and the point of what I was saying last week and what I hold to this week, and I think it's widely understood amongst the miners, is that the miners depend for their strength on national action. Action in every coalfield and unity in every coalfield around the central purpose of their cause, of their policy, of the fight that they're putting up, and their efforts to keep the coal mines open and the British coal industry thriving. And indeed, I support that strategy of keeping the pits open very strongly indeed. That's where the legitimacy comes in. It isn't a question of the legitimacy of the leadership. It is a question of how the action is perceived and what can be the consequences of that action if every coalfield is not carried in the course of trying to make these defensive arrangements and win the miners' case.
Well then, which miners do you support tonight? Those who are on strike or those who are going to work?
Oh, I support the efforts of miners to keep the pits open, and our National Executive Committee of the Labour Party unanimously, and indeed the Shadow Cabinet has given every indication that we are strongly opposed to the strategy of the National Coal Board and the government in trying to indeed obliterate whole coalfields, because that's what ultimately the strategy boils down to. And so consequently, we support the efforts to try and keep those pits open. The question arises not so much of that strategy, but one of tactics in pursuit of that objective. And it appears to me that the, I use the word again, the cohesion, the coherence too, of that strategy would be enhanced if there was a national ballot and a result to that ballot that would indicate that there was widespread, and I think majority support throughout the coal mining industry and the National Union of Mine Workers for a strategy that was geared to keeping those pits open.
But at the moment, the miners are following totally different tactics. Some are going to work, some are not going to work. Now, how can you get cohesion, and why do you think Mr. Scargill isn't actually following your policy?
Well, I'd have to make an examination of the precise strategic deployment of Arthur Scargill and the executive of the National Union of Mine Workers. And of course, I am not a member of that executive or indeed of the union. And whilst I can offer views and opinions, they don't carry a particular strength or assertiveness inside that union. They may be of value to me, they may be of value to others, but I think that the objective of any exercises of offering opinions should be to try and influence affairs in the proper direction. Now, as far as the National Union of Mine Workers are concerned, the only view that I've expressed and the only view that has a sustained validity is that it is necessary to get that cohesion. And apart from that general consideration, it is literally for the miners to make their decisions. You see, it's an extraordinary thing that over this last month, an organisation, an institution, the National Union of Mine Workers, over which I have no constitutional control and would seek none because I believe in free and independent trade unions, has conducted itself in a particular way. I am held in some way, in some sections of public opinion and journalistic opinion, to be responsible, or to, the view is put, I should accept responsibility in that direction. And yet the Prime Minister, who has direct responsibility and control over another institution in our society, the National Coal Board, is not criticised somehow for not undertaking an exercise of the powers which he has. Now, I can't actually assert powers which I haven't got. I think that she should assert powers that she actually has. And that would subscribe significantly to overcoming the difficulties in the coal mining industries, which I think is in everybody in Britain's interest.
Now, do you agree with your party's General Secretary, Mr. Jim Mortimer, that mass picketing is not intimidation?
Oh, mass picketing by itself, the collection of large numbers of people at a picketing site, is not intimidatory. I acknowledge very readily, and indeed I've made it absolutely plain, that the conduct of certain forms of picketing can be intimidatory. But of course, without trying to qualify or diminish my criticism of people who act in an intimidatory and potentially violent manner, I must say that another form of intimidation has to be brought to the public's attention. That is the intimidation of saying to people that we are going to remove your living in areas where the coal miners themselves know that there isn't any chance whatsoever of them obtaining alternative employment. And the other form of intimidation is for the chairman of the National Coal Board to say to miners, well, if they're going to stay on strike, they're going to be out for a very long time. There being no flexibility or acknowledgement of the position of the miners in that, despite the fact that one day the miners are going to have to go back to work, coal is going to have to be mined, and management and men are going to have to get on with each other. Now, there's an intimidation, especially when you're talking to miners, a miner with a wife and 2 children, for instance, on £24 a week of supplementary benefit, and that's all they've got to live on. Somebody who says to them, you're going to be out for a very long time, is very definitely using intimidatory tactics in order to scare people back to work. There's no doubt about that at all.
But Mr. Kinnock, surely such a calculation must be made by people when they come out on strike, and surely a union official who encourages his members to come out on strike and their families to face such hardship should have thought of that when they began it all.
Oh, I acknowledge that, and there has to be a strategy thought out clearly about the particular tactics to be employed in the course of a dispute, because I don't think there's any trade union leader at any level, from shop steward through to branch officials, district officials, national officials, who cheerfully takes on the prospect of a strike without calculating the effect on the members of his union or her union when they go on strike. So that's acknowledged. What I'm talking about, since intimidation is a feature of discussion in this particular strike, that whilst not diminishing or diluting in any way my criticism of any intimidation that might occasionally, in a limited number of instances, have arisen on picket lines, that to put that alongside the moral suasion and the economic efforts at intimidation, that another feature of the strike coming from the coal board and gets scant attention by comparison with the more dramatic forms of threats which we occasionally see on picket lines.
But don't people write to you because they write to some others among us from the South Yorkshire coalfield and from the Nottinghamshire coalfield saying that there is intimidation in their mining villages?
Yes, certainly, and I readily acknowledge that there have been people without any prompting or organisation or stimulation from their leadership, irresponsible people, who are a grievous embarrassment to their colleagues in the trade union movement, because that's not how British trade union movement has conducted itself. We can all remember in the course of the last year seeing the scenes from, say, France or Belgium, or even to some extent Germany, when there's a threat of closure or a dispute in an industry, people taking to the streets in their tin hats and with baseball bats and pickaxe handles. Now, that has never been a feature of British trade unionism. It isn't a main feature of British trade unionism now. It is at the fringe, it belongs at the fringe, it should be pushed out of the fringe. And I've no doubt at all that people have made intimidatory efforts. It would be quite wrong, however, to see that as a central or main characteristic. And of course, those people who feel that they've been subject to intimidation get my support in the way that I support people against any form of intimidation. I'm also getting letters and more direct contact, including in my own constituency, from people who are trying to keep their families on literally starvation wages, £24 a week, and in the case of single minors with no dependents, nothing a week, who are very conscious of the fact that they too are being subjected to intimidation.
Well, now, you accuse Mrs. Thatcher of being dictatorial and arrogant. Those were your words to the Scottish Trades Union Congress.
Yes.
But didn't she win the election?
Oh,
and
sure.
isn't she carrying out her election manifesto?
Well, I think that certainly there's no question about the fact that demonstrably, mathematically, democratically, Mrs. Thatcher won the election. What I would have hoped is that even though she is my sworn opponent, that she would have used the strength that came from that renewed mandate and that very large parliamentary majority with a certain magnanimity, not with weakness, but acknowledging that there was a diversion or divergence of opinions, both within her own party and in British politics generally. But Mrs. Thatcher has not taken that opportunity of a larger majority in order to conduct affairs in that way. And if anything, she has become more ruthless and more narrow-minded and more inflexible in the months since the last general election. Much, of course, to the outrage of large sections of her own party, as we see demonstrated almost at weekly intervals in the lobbies of the House of Commons, where groups of very distinguished Conservatives, former Prime Ministers and former Foreign Secretaries and all kinds of people who could not be regarded as being eccentric within the Conservative Party, take themselves into the other lobby or make very forceful speeches critical of the manner, the method, and indeed much of the material content of what is current Prime Ministerial policy. So yes, the Prime Minister certainly won the election. My quarrel with her and my accusation yesterday of the manner in which she conducts affairs arises from the fact that we're not in a police state or anywhere near a police state. There is no adoption of totalitarian method, but there is a combination of method and of conduct and of manner and insensitivity, a disregard of a general public interest and general public responses, a willingness to use unemployment as a main economic tool that in many people's minds add together to give a definition of tyranny. I don't think we live in a tyranny. I think that there are enough free institutions in this country in order to ensure that we never live under tyranny. But that doesn't stop people from exercising tyrannical methods. And in her own party and in other respects, I believe that Mrs. Thatcher actually is exercising those methods now.
But isn't she still ahead in the opinion polls? Yeah. And aren't you, in fact, slipping? And is that not perhaps because of the miners?
I think that it probably has more to do with the miners than with anything else. Actually, the slippage in the opinion polls as recorded by Gallup this morning was somewhat less than I'd anticipated it would be. That's not to hope that it will be bigger next month. But it's quite obvious that there is associated in the public mind, there is an association between the Labour Party and the trade union movement, and I'm glad that the association exists in fact. I'm a trade unionist, I come from a family of trade unionists, and I value deeply the relationship with the trade union movement. But that then means that there's a further assumption arising out of the association that somehow the Labour Party and the leader of the Labour Party has got a magic wand or reins leading out from the leader's office in the House of Commons that can be tugged whenever an industrial dispute takes place or a trade union wants to conduct itself in a particular fashion or adopt a particular policy. And of course, no such reins exist. I'm not sure whether I'm glad of that or sorry about that, but nevertheless, they don't exist. So consequently, when we see on our television screens twice nightly, 3 times nightly, the scenes of uproar, then the association grows, and we all know the story after that. It's always happened. I presume that it always will happen, though I would hope that people understand the constitutional relationship, the limitation on the powers of the leader of the opposition and of the Labour Party, and consequently don't draw their conclusions about the Labour Party on the basis of what a union might be doing in particular circumstances in order to defend its position, its jobs, its members' living standards. Though it's certainly the case, I believe, over the last month, that our progress has been stalled and very, very slightly reversed by the fact that there is a dispute that is spread across Britain and is frequently referred to and daily pictured.
Well, going away from that uproar, you've criticised the government about the National Health Service. But isn't this government spending more per head of the population on the health service, taking inflation out of account, than Labour did?
Well, you say taking inflation out of account to begin with. On the basis of the general cost of living index, they can make a claim for additional expenditures.
18%, I think, above the retail price.
Yes, if you set it against the medical price index, as many authorities do, you'll find that the figure is significantly smaller. If you take into account the actual demographic shift, the fact that we've got more elderly people living longer now, and there's inadequate response to that, then you'll find the figure smaller still. And if you talk to the British Medical Association or the Royal Colleges of the medical professions, both of them, if you talk to the nursing profession, the response you will get, both from them and from the Department of Health and Social Security itself, is that in order to sustain levels of healthcare in Britain, expenditure should this year be going up by 2%. In real terms, it's being cut by 0.5%, so it's lagging behind. And the case to be made is not just for the defence of the health service at 1979 or 1980 levels, it is for the modernisation and improvement of the health service. And whatever else the figures demonstrate, and I'm prepared to go very thoroughly into the figures and the experience of people daily engaged in the health service, both as carers and as patients, shows very, very conclusively that the health service is far from being safe in Mrs. Thatcher's hands, as she claims. Indeed, it's very unsafe, because not only are these effective cuts in being, there is also a general environment of hostility, ideological hostility in today's Conservative leadership. It hasn't always been the case to the National Health Service.
Though she is still spending more. Now, take education, which is your special subject before you became leader of the Labour Party. Isn't spending again, and accounting for inflation, at an all-time high and planned to rise higher?
Yes, it's both. And if I can just put the point to you, that spending more is one thing. Spending enough is another thing. Getting the right value for money in terms of patients and in terms of education and instruction and training is another thing too. And my quarrel isn't with the cash additional expenditure that the government is making. It is the fact that it is insufficient in authoritatively calculated and objectively arrived at terms of care in the health service and proper provision in the education service. Now, there is expenditure in the education service. It actually has been cut because of the massive cut in the rate support grant to local authorities, who are mainly responsible for the provision of the schooling and further education system in this country. And the universities too complain very earnestly and with great legitimacy of the effect that cuts have had on them.
Although student numbers are up if you include the polytechnics and the local authority colleges.
And that's because we happen to have an age group of 18 to 22-year-olds in Britain now, which is bigger than at any time in history. We've got the effects working through of the birth boom. And so naturally expenditure is going to be going up. The question for a modern democracy, indeed in the middle of a technological revolution, the question that's got to be asked is not whether the expenditure has gone up. Is it enough to properly equip our young people to be effective workers and citizens in a different age of production, when there are different requirements for different responses to different commercial and cultural and trading and investment and employment needs? And the answer that comes back all the time from headmasters' conferences, from employers, is no, we are not investing enough in the right way in education. And therefore, I wouldn't quarrel with the fact that there's a cash rise. I will quarrel with the idea that it is sufficient or that it's being spent in the right way, in the right places.
Do you feel now that you've settled in as Labour's leader?
I settled in. Funnily enough, I was talking about this earlier today, and you can no more settle in as a leader of a party than you can settle in as, say, a rugby coach or a football manager. The only match that really matters on any day of the week is the one next week. And so settling in with all its implied complacency is something, in that sense, I will never do. In terms of being comfortable with a job, the different functions that have to be performed and so on, Prime Minister's questions, there's no problem about that. But I've got a certain restless instinct in any case, and a very energetic attitude towards things So settling in is something that generally isn't an activity to which I aspire.
But what do you say to the critics, some of them inside your own party, that there should be more substance in your leadership?
I'd like them to define the substance. If it's in terms of the making of speeches that are absolutely jam-packed with solid material and argument, then there's no question about substance. If it is the question of trying to make new arrangements in the party for our campaigning strategy, which I've done, for our new joint policy development, which I've done, for a new professionalism in our approach to the advertising and communication of the party's ideas and policies, which we're doing, and I think most people applaud the fact that that's been done successfully. If we look at the effectiveness of the leadership and the unity that has been maintained and indeed grows, and that's the daily report in the party since last October, I don't think we're short of substance. What some people mistake for a lack of substance is the fact that we give not a glossy exterior, but a certain appearance and presentation which has got a certain style that people don't associate normally with the Labour Party. I always have, actually, and right back from the earliest days, socialists have always presented their arguments in a way that is best communicated and most attractive to the public. I mean, it's no point in disfiguring your own ideas or obscuring them with inadequate presentation. Now, because we are making that better presentation, and that applies to right across the party, I try my best in that respect, but many others do too. Because the party is doing that, the implication is, well, if they are that good at singing the song, the words can't be very good. I think it's an inadequate and inaccurate way to look at things. I think we've got style and substance, but the most important of these, of course, is the substance.
Now, you're said not to be an advocate of what's called spray-on socialism.
That's right.
But how are you going to control your left wing, and are there not fissures already appearing between you and Mr. Benn and some of his policies? Over, say, Liverpool?
Yes.
Over, say, the miners?
Yes, I'm sure that there will be differences of opinion, are differences of opinion in the party about, for instance, the stance being taken by the Labour group in Liverpool. I've made my view very clear, and the Labour Party conference last year made its view very clear. And it is the fact that the primary function of Labour councillors, even in desperately difficult circumstances, and there are very few circumstances more difficult than in the city of Liverpool, I readily acknowledge and grieve for that. But nevertheless, their primary obligation is to stay in post and do their best to defend, protect, mitigate the effect of central government cuts on the services on which people so heavily depend, especially the old and the very young, and indeed the whole community depend. And that's the view I take, and that's the view I will sustain. And there may be people who disagree with me over that. I am the party leader, I was duly elected, and that's the view I intend within my power to enforce. Now, there are going to be arguments in the Labour Party. They don't begin to compare with the great cleavages of opinion that exist currently in the Conservative Party. Perhaps the Conservative Party, for a variety of reasons, is rather better at putting a cosmetic on those differences. But there is no division or difficulty in the Labour Party that starts to compare with the ideological warfare that's now going on in the Conservative Party.
But aren't the militant tendency trying at this moment to unseat people like Mr. Peter Shaw and Mr. Gerald Kaufman?
I don't think they are, actually. I know that there are repeated stories printed saying that come reselection, there are this number of people in danger, as it's said. I think that they're vastly exaggerated, and what always amuses me is the fact that always the same names appear. If there was some great conspiracy spreading like an epidemic across the country, and if the militant tendency, as you describe them, or Trotskyists of other varieties, were about that business, then I'm sure the list would be longer. I'm not being complacent. What I am saying is this: the Labour Party is united. It will not tolerate the disuniters, and that's where our strength is coming from and where our strength will grow.
Thank you, Mr. Kinnock.
Thank you.